I'm Charlotte McLeod with investingnews.com, and here today with me is Ted Butler. He's an independent analyst who writes for so many publications. We will list them: the Ingle We Trust Report, Sound Money Report, Silver Advisor, and the Morgan Report. And hopefully that is all of them that I got correctly.
You got it perfectly correct, Charlotte. Thanks for having me.
Nice to have you back. We're here at PDAC. We've made it essentially to the end of day 2 at this point. Hopefully you've been out and about. I've been stuck here. How has sentiment been feeling to you at the show?
Well, it's actually been incredibly positive. I was here 2 years ago. That's the last time I was here. And I actually feel that the energy is more palpable. We're starting to see more generalists. We're seeing more institutions here. We've had conversations with quite considerably large hedge funds as well. And I feel we're not by no means at the champagne bottle popping, blow off top of this market yet, but we are no longer at the bargain basement prices that we saw maybe 2-3 years ago. So we're somewhere between those two extremes. I would still say that we're not even halfway yet. I do believe that when we think about where silver is, and we can talk about that exact contextualization later, I think we're probably about a third or a quarter of the way through.
I think that's essentially what I've been hearing from people in terms of where we are in this move. And yes, let's take a look at silver. Let's hone in on that. It's been a while since we last spoke, so we need to catch up on a lot in silver. I was wondering if you could walk me through that move from $50 to past 100. It was below 50 the last time we talked. I know you were expecting triple digits, but perhaps not this soon.
No, not this soon. I'm obviously happy to see silver at these prices because ultimately the silver silver mining companies at these silver prices are making maybe 70 to 80% margins, right? Which is far better than even the best companies blue chip wise like Visa and MasterCard, right? So on that basis, I'm happy, but it's certainly been a rise fueled by different aspects of silver demand. We've had industrial demand as the basis of that silver demand, almost like a price floor in some sense. And in my understanding, that's going to maintain, despite the higher prices. Solar is appearing to be resilient. I've had many conversations over the last few days that would suggest that's the case. Of course, also we've had the investment demand and the speculation. There's been arbitrage opportunities from the differential in the price in China and in London. There's been spot price, future prices, dynamics that's influenced things. There's been backwardation. We've seen a real explosion, I guess, in silver investment demand that's probably provoked this scale of reaction. And I would imagine some generalists have come in and fueled that as well. But a lot of this for me is the response from 5 years of fundamental deficits. This was a bullish case that was grounded in fundamentals that has since been taken to a new level by speculative interests. But at the same time, I maintain that we are still relatively early in how far this bull market could go. And the reason I believe that is if we look at the 70s as a guide for today, the price of silver at a cumulative return from 1971 to 1980, we were around, I think it's 400%, right? Maybe even 300 and something percent. But we're only around 130% today on a cumulative return basis. And so I'm talking from the 2024 breakout up until 2026 today. So we're roughly where I would say we're at the end of 1973 where silver was in the 70s. And we're probably going to see a period of high-level consolidation. I would imagine between maybe, let's say, $100 and maybe $70 over the next few years. I actually do believe that we don't need higher silver prices. I don't want an explosion because it's not sustainable for the market. What I would like to see is that high-level consolidation, and I think that brings a lot of certainty to producers, certainty to the juniors and developers, and ultimately we will have that blow off top, but I don't think we're there yet. I think that's a few years away.
Yes, I think that answers one of the questions I was going to ask, which is where you see the silver price going from here. So you're expecting some consolidation so that we can all believe this is real. During that consolidation, do you anticipate spikes like we've seen this past January or just, more of a calm market?
Silver is always volatile, and volatility for me is what makes silver such an opportunity ultimately, right? And I don't expect to see that volatility decrease, unfortunately. So if you don't like the volatility, then maybe your stomach isn't right for the silver market. It's the devil's metal, we all know this. But at the same time, I think those who are prepared to wait for the opportunity over the course of the next few years, they will be looking at a higher silver price because of the backdrop that we've got here, Charlotte. It's obviously the US dollar is a fantastic part of that, and its ultimate demise and the way that Trump is wanting to increase military spending, and ultimately that feeds into silver demand too. I'll just take a moment to talk about this, that in 1943, the US War Production Board cited that silver demand from military applications alone would need to be 200 million ounces. That's the same as what solar panels consume today, which is 20% of the market, right? So you think about, I'm not saying it's going to reach 200 million ounces again today, but you think about with everything going on in Iran, with not only the retaliation that will propose from China and Russia, who've condemned this move by the US to bomb Iran, and you look at Taiwan, that could potentially be a next phase of this conflict that ultimately plays out between these global powers. That feeds into higher military demand, and higher military spending, necessitates higher silver usage, because silver is an industrial metal. It's the most conductive metal in the world, and so it's going to be used in these military applications.
Any thoughts on replacement in this type of, or substitution, I should say, in these types of applications? That's a concern I've heard a little bit more about as the price goes up. And I think you were mentioning you were having some conversations even here about that.
Yes, and it absolutely does happen. Thrifting does happen in the solar panels, and we do see more copper usage happening, right? But at the same time, copper is not as good as a material for solar panels as silver. It corrodes quicker. So in that case, the market may shift to copper, but then 2-3 years later, they might need to replace that copper because it's corroded. In which case, you would have been better off using the higher priced silver in the first place because it saves you money in the long run. Now, it's not just an example, so that's not exactly going to play out like that, but it's an insight as in to say that higher silver prices do not necessarily mean that industrial demand is going to fall, because it's so important and so irreplaceable in most of these applications that it maintains.
Very, very interesting. And I wonder if we can talk a little bit more about China's role in the silver market, because one of the themes that I've been hearing a lot about is that of the metal moving essentially from west to east because the demand there is so strong.
Yeah.
How significant is China right now? What role do you see it playing for silver moving forward?
Yeah, China consumes so much silver. It's the biggest consumer, and I think that's reflected in the higher price over there because it's more important for the industry. It's used in all things from solar to EVs to AI and different data center applications, which we'll get more granular this year about in the Ingold We Trust report, which comes out in May, by the way. And so for solar, I think it has like 60% or 80% of the market. It's a massive influence, and it will probably stay that way. EV rollout in China is far greater than it is in the West, in the US. If you look at the numbers, you look at companies like BYD, leading battery makers globally. You look at CATL, they're another Chinese company. There's obviously Tesla on the US side, but the Chinese companies dominate this space. And I think they will continue to do so.
And what about the West? I know I just mentioned the metal is flowing from the West to China, but we had talked about perhaps the $50 level being a time when people wake up and they have a new interest in silver. Are we seeing that, or to what extent are we seeing that over here?
I think we are seeing it. I think that the retail investor is starting to show more interest in silver, and just certainly from the conversations that we've had on the floor today, I'm seeing more younger faces, more retail investors, people who've come from AI, who just actually weren't even aware of the case for silver a couple of years ago, who've seen resources and they've been compelled by the investment case, right? And so on the ground, it feels that way. In terms of ETF inflows, I think it has started to pick up recently. But we've obviously had that big rise, and so I don't expect to see the increases maintain at that level of volume. And I think, like I say, that's why I'm calling for consolidation now in a somewhat conservative way.
Right. And although you're expecting consolidation, I want to talk a little bit about silver's volatility, because that is so important, especially if you're a new person coming in, you have to know that that is going to happen. And I wonder for you, so for example, at the end of January when we saw the big spike up in silver, how were you playing that? Is that something that you traded? Did you take profits? What was your approach?
So my physical silver holdings tend to stay the same because I believe in the overriding case for currency debasement. What I will say is that the silver stocks that I wanted to hold that was a moment to realize that, to maybe take a few profits, like just trim, right? I'm not talking about this is over. I know Rick Rule has sold a lot of his silver stocks already. Me at 25 years old, I have a totally different time horizon, right? And that really ultimately means that I have a different risk tolerance, right? So I'm more prepared to hold silver stocks for the long run. And I think in terms of silver, you just have to be wary that, we are elevated prices. As I said, I'm not expecting the price to go up extremely much higher from here in the short term. But in January, it was a reminder that, yeah, some people might want to rotate into gold at that time if you have a higher risk tolerance, right? And actually a 50-to-1 gold-silver ratio, which where it was at the time, that's the average of maybe since 1900. Even 1900. And so we've gone from 90-to-1 to 50-to-1. And if you're saying that at that point silver was fairly valued relative to gold, maybe it makes sense to trade some of your silver into gold.
Yeah, I think this is a good reminder to personalize your
Of course,
approach.
yeah.
And the other thing, while we're talking about the silver stocks, we said before we turn the camera on, we want to talk about jurisdictional risk when it comes to the companies. And Mexico is really in focus right
Yeah.
now. So I think a lot of people have told me today, well, you can't really be in the silver industry if you don't have Mexico exposure. So how are you feeling about the company or the country right now?
Yeah, I think it's really important to apply a nuanced perspective. In other words, what happens in one state is not necessarily going to impact a state that's hundreds of kilometers away. We know there have been incidents that have happened there recently. We know there's been a rise in violence. But at the same time, the good quality management teams navigate that. And if you look at the track records of great teams, like I say, they find ways to de-risk, and the right companies do that. We cover those companies at Silver Advisor, and we hope that we trust in those management teams to navigate those difficult periods. But I think, as you mentioned, Charlotte, as a silver investor, with Mexico producing 25% of global silver production, you can't ignore Mexico. You can't put it on the back burner and say, I'm going to ignore it completely. You could, but you're probably going to limit your upside. And I think that's the big thing with Mexico here. It's the risk reward. Actually, a lot of these companies, which have nothing to do with incidents that have happened in recent days, their share prices have fallen off, and they're trading at a discount. But I think to me that presents more of an opportunity to ultimately get at these companies at a discount to what they were trading at formerly before certain incidents happened.
Right. They all essentially get painted with a broad brush.
Yes.
Well, and while we're talking about jurisdiction, I believe you wanted to mention, this might be a little bit outside of
No.
silver, but opportunities in Latin America. So what is on your mind there?
Well, I'm based down in Paraguay.
Of
I
course.
have been for a few months now. What I'm seeing in Latin America right now on the ground is, and in the political sphere, is actually a shift towards the right. It began, I guess, with Milei a couple of years ago, and he's introduced some really pro-mining policies, such as the RIGI Act, which ultimately incentivizes investments over $200 million in Argentina with tax breaks and FX incentives. And so that kind of opening of the doors to mining investment in Latin America is happening, and it's actually influencing the countries surrounding Argentina. So it began in Argentina, but now last year we had Bolivia swing right, we had Chile swing right, and actually that's, again, creating a lot of opportunities for particularly silver mining companies, because Chile has, although a lot of it's a byproduct of copper mines, Chile is one of the top 5 silver producing countries in the world, and so is Bolivia. So the fact that these countries are now, shaking hands, the presidents of these countries are shaking hands with Donald Trump, flying out to the US, forging new relationships, welcoming foreign investment, I think that's a really great backdrop. And that's exactly why I'm in Latin America, is to be on the ground whilst these new relationships unfold.
Have you been to, I know you do site visits sometimes, anywhere you've visited recently?
Yeah, in a couple of months ago I visited Salta in Argentina, which a couple of silver companies there, Argenta Silver and Abra Silver, I visited those projects. I also visited in Colombia over a year ago now, Outcrop Silver's project. And in Mexico, actually, I visited 2 projects there, Minarum Silver, was Minarum Gold, and Kootenay Silver. So that was probably in the last 6 months. I've got a nice broad-based feeling of attitudes towards Latin America and attitudes towards mining there. And generally, the management teams that I've encountered seem very capable to handle any risks that are at play. And honestly, if you look at some companies in BC or with certain changes in the permitting legislation, the perception of risk really depends. It's in the eye of the beholder, right? So someone might say there's more risk in BC than there is in Mexico, but I guess it depends on your personal risk tolerance, and that's ultimately subjective, right?
Yes, I have heard that said before. So it does depend on how you look at it. Just a final point on silver that I think we need to mention, and that is the market manipulation concerns that have popped up. Well, they're always ever present under the surface, but especially in recent weeks with the CME Group issue.
Right.
A lot of worries about what's going on there. How do you integrate that into your approach for silver?
I believe that there are moments in which the stars align for these big banks and trading houses to maybe, I wouldn't say collude, but I think there are definitely moments where they get together to perhaps influence the price, right? I don't know if it's a wide-scale manipulation. I think I've seen it on an individual scale. Like, JP Morgan have been
Sure.
convicted for, or at least had charges pressed against them, if I remember it correctly, for doing that very thing, and they call it spoofing. And it does happen, but I think fundamentally it's not going to change the direction of the silver price. I think it may create some more short-term volatility, and we've certainly seen that over the last few months. But the fundamentals for me serve as the principal determinants of the silver price, right? And as long as there is a supply deficit, which there still is, and the Silver Institute is predicting in 2026 that there will be 67 million ounces of silver in deficit, as long as that exists, the manipulation concerns and the spoofing in the short term is kind of background noise to me. And so that would be my way I'd answer that.
Very, very fair way to look at it. And we will wrap up here. I'll send you back out onto the show floor, unless you had any final thoughts you would leave investors with.
I think what I would say is since 2022, which is ironically when I withdrew from my Masters in Finance course, there was an inflection point. Since that point, the 60/40 portfolio has underperformed considerably relative to gold and silver. You look at the 60/40 portfolio fund, which I think is a Vanguard fund, and the name has just slipped my mind at the moment. It was something like a 12% increase, and gold and silver, of course, up like 200%. And a lot of those reasons were geopolitical risk reasons. We're living in an age where military spending is at a record high. The countries with nuclear powers have continued to increase their capacities since 2022. The geopolitical risk index is above 1 and has been above that for the last few years, a new normal, if you like. And so that's the thing that I would be considering most, is that are you positioned to navigate this level of elevated geopolitical risk? Because, it might be Iran this week, it might be Venezuela a few months ago, right? But it could be Taiwan later this year. We've got a president in the US who is on a warpath, it would seem, with his, Pete Hegseth, and that creates a lot of uncertainty for markets, and that is obviously conducive to higher gold and silver prices.
Certainly food for thought for everybody who maybe hasn't been thinking about this yet. So thank you so much for coming on. As usual, always good to talk about silver with you.
Thank you, Charlotte. Appreciate it.
Of course. And once again, I'm Charlotte McLeod with investingnews.com, and this is Ted Butler.